If you walked into a British classroom in the 1970s, it didn't feel like a place designed for children. It felt like a place preparing you for the real world, whether you were ready or not. Rows of wooden desks, the faint smell of dust, ink, and polish. No bright colors, no soft language, no constant explanations. By the age of 7 or 8, you already knew what was expected of you. Sit properly, listen carefully, don't ask unnecessary questions. And most importantly, get on with it. School wasn't just about subjects, it was about learning how to behave, how to cope, and how to manage responsibility far earlier than most children today ever would. Many of the things British children were taught in classrooms back then weren't written down as official lessons. They were simply part of everyday school life, so normal at the time that no one thought to question them. Looking back now, some of these lessons sound unbelievable. Not because they were rare, but because almost every child went through them. And that's what makes them so hard to imagine today. Number 1. Woodwork, metalwork, and real tools in the classroom. By the time many British children reached the age of 11 or 12, they were handed real tools at school. Not plastic versions, not demonstrations behind safety glass, but proper saws, chisels, hammers, and sometimes even metal lathes. In a woodwork room that smelled of dust and oil, children barely out of primary school were expected to measure, cut, and shape timber with the same seriousness as an adult apprentice. There were few warnings, no long safety briefings, certainly no protective goggles handed out to every pupil. You learned by doing, and if you slipped, you learned faster next time. A nicked finger or splinter wasn't considered alarming, it was simply part of the lesson. Teachers expected children to develop respect for tools not through explanation, but through experience. For parents today, the idea of a 12-year-old handling sharp equipment without constant supervision would feel unthinkable. But in the 1970s classroom, it was normal. You were trusted to focus, trusted not to fool around, and trusted to accept responsibility for your own mistakes. Number 2. Home economics as a life requirement, not a choice. At around 12 to 14 years old, many pupils found themselves in a home economics room rather than a traditional classroom. This wasn't framed as an optional interest or creative outlet. It was presented as something every child needed to learn, whether they enjoyed it or not. Cooking, cleaning, planning meals, and understanding basic household routines were treated as core skills for adult life. You learned how to prepare simple meals, wash up properly, and leave a workspace clean, not because it was enjoyable, but because that was what being functional meant. The tone was practical and sometimes blunt. You weren't told you were expressing yourself. You were told you were learning how not to be useless. For a 13-year-old, the message was clear. One day, you would run a household and ignorance would not be an excuse. Today, many parents would be surprised that schools once took such direct responsibility for teaching domestic life. In the 1970s, it wasn't seen as overreach, it was seen as preparation. Number 3. Sewing, knitting, and clothing repair. By the time children reached 11 or 12, many were expected to understand how clothes were made and maintained. Sewing lessons weren't decorative, they were functional. You learned how to stitch, patch, and repair because clothes were not disposable. A torn hem wasn't a reason to buy something new. It was a problem you were expected to fix. Knitting, stitching buttons, repairing seams, these were taught with the assumption that every child would need them at some point. For a 12-year-old today, the idea of being graded on how well they repaired a garment might feel archaic. But in the 1970s, it reflected a mindset of thrift and self-reliance that schools actively reinforced. Teachers rarely asked whether pupils enjoyed it. The value of the lesson wasn't emotional, it was practical. Number 4. Technical drawing, measurement, and precision. By 13 or 14, many British pupils were learning technical drawing. This wasn't art, it was accuracy. Straight lines, precise angles, careful measurements, and neat execution were treated as indicators of discipline and intelligence. Mistakes weren't brushed off. A drawing that was sloppy or imprecise wasn't seen as expressive. It was seen as careless. Children were taught that clarity and accuracy mattered, not just in schoolwork, but in life. Parents today might find it surprising that such demanding technical standards were placed on young teenagers. But in the 1970s classroom, this kind of precision was seen as a foundation for trades, engineering, and structured thinking. Number 5. Being taught how to sit, stand, and carry yourself. By the age of 10 or 11, children were often corrected not just for what they said, but for how they sat, stood, and moved. Posture mattered. Slouching wasn't just bad for your back, it was considered a sign of poor discipline. Teachers would remind pupils to sit up straight, keep their feet still, and present themselves properly. These weren't suggestions, they were expectations. The underlying lesson was that how you carried yourself reflected who you were. For parents today, the idea of correcting a 10-year-old's posture as part of their education might seem strict. In the 1970s, it was simply part of learning how to exist in the world. Number 6. Handwriting as a measure of character. At 8, 9, or 10 years old, children's handwriting was treated as something deeply personal. Neat writing wasn't just praised, it was expected. Sloppy handwriting wasn't seen as a learning difference. It was often interpreted as laziness or lack of effort. Children spent hours practicing letter shapes, spacing, and consistency. Penmanship was drilled until it became muscle memory. Teachers believed that controlled writing reflected controlled thinking. Today, many parents would be shocked to learn how seriously handwriting was taken, especially when children were still so young. But in the 1970s classroom, a child's handwriting was considered a visible sign of discipline. Number 7. Silence, focus, and attention as skills. By the age of 7 or 8, British children were expected to sit quietly for extended periods. Silence wasn't just a rule. It was something you were actively trained to achieve. Children learned to keep their hands still, eyes forward, and mouths shut, not because they were afraid, but because focus was treated as a skill worth mastering. Teachers rarely explained why. The assumption was that learning to concentrate was part of growing up. In today's world, where attention is constantly interrupted, many parents would find it remarkable that such expectations were placed on such young children. In the 1970s, it was simply how classrooms functioned. Number 8. Following instructions without question. By 10 or 11, children were expected to follow instructions immediately without debate or clarification. You weren't encouraged to ask why. You were encouraged to listen and act. This wasn't framed as oppression, it was framed as readiness. Teachers believed that learning to follow instructions prepared children for work, adulthood, and responsibility. Parents today might find this unsettling, especially when applied to children so young. But in the 1970s, unquestioning obedience in certain contexts was considered a practical skill. Number 9. Memorization and mental endurance. By 9 or 10, many pupils were trained to memorize large amounts of information. Times tables, spelling lists, poems, historical facts, all expected to be recalled accurately and under pressure. Understanding was secondary. retention was key. Teachers believed that mental endurance was built through repetition and effort, not through constant explanation. For modern parents, the idea of prioritizing memorization over comprehension may feel outdated. In the 1970s classroom, it was foundational. Number 10. Reading aloud as a public test. From as young as 7 years old, children were expected to read aloud in front of the class. There was no opt-out. Nervousness wasn't accommodated. Mistakes were corrected in real time. The belief was simple. Learning to speak clearly and confidently mattered more than avoiding discomfort. For many children, this was daunting. For teachers, it was character building. Today, many parents would be uncomfortable with the pressure this placed on young children. In the 1970s, it was routine. Number 11. Moral behavior built into ordinary lessons. By 8 or 9, children weren't just learning subjects. They were learning right and wrong through everyday instruction. Manners, politeness, and respect were woven into lessons without being labeled as moral education. You learned when to speak, how to address adults, and what behavior was acceptable simply by observing consequences. The classroom itself reinforced social norms. For parents today, the subtlety of this approach might seem surprising, but in the 1970s, it was considered effective. Number 12. Practical maths for real life. By 10 or 11, maths lessons often focused on real-world application. Children learned how to calculate change, measure distances, and estimate costs. This wasn't abstract theory. It was preparation for shops, bills, and work. Mistakes weren't shrugged off. Accuracy mattered because it was assumed you would need these skills soon. Parents today might be surprised by how practical and unforgiving these lessons were. In the 1970s, they reflected everyday life. Number 13. Respect for authority as an outcome. By the time pupils reached 11 or 12, they had learned how authority worked. Teachers didn't ask to be respected. Respect was expected. This wasn't always gentle, but it was consistent. Children learned when to comply, when to listen, and when not to challenge. The lesson wasn't emotional safety, it was social order. For parents today, this might feel overly rigid. In the 1970s, it was considered necessary. Number 14. Preparation for work, not self-expression. By 13 or 14, schooling was increasingly framed as preparation for employment. Lessons focused on reliability, punctuality, and usefulness. Creativity existed, but it wasn't prioritized. The goal wasn't self-discovery, it was competence. Parents today might find this approach limiting. In the 1970s, it was pragmatic. Number 15. Being proper as a skill you could learn. From a young age, sometimes as early as 6 or 7, children were taught how to behave properly. Speech, manners, posture, and tone all mattered. Being proper wasn't about wealth. It was about fitting in and being respectable. Schools took this role seriously. For parents today, the idea of teaching propriety might feel outdated. In the 1970s, it was central. Number 16. Growing up faster was simply expected. The final lesson, woven through everything, was that childhood didn't last forever. By 10 or 11, children were expected to act older, cope better, and rely less on adults. There was no constant reassurance, no detailed emotional explanations. You were expected to adapt. And while many of these lessons would shock parents today, they shaped a generation that learned early how to function in a demanding world. Looking back, It's easy to judge the 1970s classroom through modern eyes. Some lessons feel harsh, others feel strangely missing today. But for those who lived it, this wasn't cruelty. It was normal. Schools weren't trying to raise children, they were trying to prepare adults. And whether that was right or wrong depends entirely on who you ask. If you were there, you remember it. If you weren't, it probably sounds unbelievable. And that difference alone says a lot about how much education, and childhood itself, has changed.